A decorated ex-soldier's rejection from a struggling rural school that would not only transform an entire educational district, but uncover a remarkable learning methodology that had been quietly changing lives since the Vietnam War. The astonishing connection between a small-town principal's dismissive attitude and a federal judge's unexpected appearance that would reveal educational innovations hidden for over 50 years, all triggered by one veteran's refusal to accept that children with learning differences couldn't be reached. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if this journey of discovery intrigues, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've prepared something truly special for you. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Pinewood Elementary as Sergeant Marcus Bennett sat across from Principal Harriet Vaughn, watching her scan his teaching application with thinly veiled skepticism. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cramped office filled with participation trophies and framed teaching certificates. "Mr. Bennett," she said, setting down the folder with a dismissive tap, "while we appreciate your military service, Pinewood Elementary requires educators with formal teaching credentials. Your alternative approach to learning wouldn't align with our established methodologies." At 34, the former Special Forces sergeant had faced rejection before, but something about this dismissal struck deeper. The struggling rural school had posted an urgent opening for a learning specialist after 3 conventional educators had cycled through the position in 18 months, unable to reach the children who needed help most. "With respect, Principal Vaughn," Marcus replied evenly, his scarred hands resting on the worn leather portfolio containing 15 years of documented results. "My experience developing specialized training for soldiers with diverse learning styles directly applies to the challenges these children face. The methods I've developed have proven successful with individuals conventional systems had written off." "That may work for soldiers, Mr. Bennett, but these are children with documented learning disabilities," Principal Vaughn countered, adjusting her reading glasses. "Our district requires standardized approaches backed by formal education credentials." She stood, signaling the interview's end. Perhaps the charter school in Westbrook might be more flexible in their requirements. Marcus gathered his materials, including the 3-inch binder containing the learning system he developed during 15 years of military service, a methodology that had begun with helping fellow soldiers overcome training obstacles and had evolved into a comprehensive approach that had quietly transformed dozens of struggling learners. "Those children you can't reach deserve more than standardized approaches that have already failed them," he said as he reached the door, his military posture contrasting with the slouching, inspirational posters adorning the wall. "Sometimes the most effective solutions come from unexpected places." "We appreciate your interest," Principal Vaughn replied mechanically. "The district will keep your application on file." As Marcus walked through the school hallway toward the exit, the sounds of structured chaos echoed from classrooms on either side. He paused at room 112, where a boy about 9 years old sat alone during recess, frustration evident as he struggled with math problems. The child's brow furrowed in concentration as he erased furiously, leaving gray smudges across the paper. The scene was painfully familiar. A child falling through the cracks of a system not designed for minds that processed information differently. Outside, the rain had intensified, matching Marcus's darkening mood. He tucked his portfolio inside his jacket and sprinted to his weathered blue pickup truck, a relic from his pre-military life that had somehow survived longer than his career plans. The drive back to his small rented cabin took Marcus past sun-faded signs welcoming visitors to Riverdale County, where tradition meets tomorrow. The irony wasn't lost on him. The rural district had been losing population for decades as young families sought opportunities elsewhere, leaving behind a school system increasingly unable to address the complex needs of its remaining students. Fields of winter wheat stretched on either side of the two-lane highway, interrupted occasionally by forgotten farm equipment and abandoned gas stations, testaments to the region's slow economic decline. Marcus had chosen Riverdale specifically because of its educational challenges. After his medical discharge following an IED injury 3 years earlier, he had dedicated himself to formalizing the learning methodology he'd developed for his unit, a system that had successfully trained soldiers other instructors had deemed unteachable. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. The display showed Dr. Carson, his former commanding officer, who had become a mentor and friend during his recovery. "How did it go?" asked the familiar voice without preamble. "About as expected," Marcus replied, climbing the porch steps to escape the intensifying rain, his left knee protesting with each step. Another souvenir from Afghanistan. "They want conventional credentials, not proven results." Dr. Carson's sigh carried through the connection. "You knew this would be an uphill battle. Educational systems resist outside innovation, especially from military sources. These kids are failing in a system that's failing them," Marcus said, unlocking his door and stepping into the sparse cabin, decorated only with bookshelves overflowing with educational theory texts and military manuals. "My methods could help them, but no one will even look at the results documentation. Remember what I told you when you first developed this system for Rodriguez and Martinez?" Dr. Carson asked, referencing 2 soldiers whose military careers had been saved by Marcus's unconventional learning approach. "Sometimes you have to go around the mountain when you can't go through it." "I remember," Marcus replied, running his hand through his close-cropped hair as he stared out the window at the rain-soaked landscape. "Rodriguez is finishing medical school now. Martinez is an engineer." "Both men the traditional system gave up on," Dr. Carson reminded him. "You found a different path for them when the standard approach failed. That's what those kids at Pinewood need, someone who sees potential where others see only problems." After ending the call, Marcus sat at his kitchen table reviewing the meticulously documented case studies, soldiers and later civilians whose lives had been transformed through his methodology. The table was covered with neatly arranged folders, each containing before and after assessments, progress tracking, and long-term outcome data. 15 years of evidence showing consistent success with learners the conventional system had failed. The rejection stung not because of personal pride, but because he knew what his approach could do for children like the boy he'd seen today. Students trapped in a system designed for minds that processed information differently than theirs. He picked up a photograph of his former unit, focusing on the faces of men he'd helped through his methods when traditional training had failed them. Outside, the storm intensified, thunder rolling across the valley as darkness fell early. Marcus made a simple dinner, military habits of efficiency persisting in civilian life, and continued refining his approach for Riverdale's specific challenges. If the front door remained closed, he'd find another entrance. He'd learned during his 3 tours in combat zones that inflexibility was often fatal. The same principle applied to education. Systems too rigid to adapt inevitably failed the very people they were designed to serve. His methodology centered on this fundamental understanding. Learning paths needed to adapt to the learner, not force the learner to adapt to a predetermined path. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision. If traditional channels remained closed, he would find another way to reach these children. He began crafting an alternative plan, starting with identifying the primary obstacles within Riverdale's educational approach. Perhaps community workshops or volunteer tutoring sessions could demonstrate his method's effectiveness where formal applications had failed. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind that distinctive petrichor scent of wet earth that reminded Marcus of deployment mornings in distant mountains. Sunlight filtered through the pines surrounding his cabin as he reviewed school board meeting minutes, searching for patterns in the district's approach to learning specialists. He was highlighting budget allocations when his phone rang. An unfamiliar local number. "Is this Sergeant Marcus Bennett?" asked a woman's voice he didn't recognize, the tone authoritative and precise. "Yes, it is. This is Judge Eliza Harwood, Federal District Court. I understand you had a meeting at Pinewood Elementary yesterday regarding your learning methodology." Marcus sat straighter, confusion evident in his voice. "Yes, ma'am. May I ask how you know about that?" "That's a longer conversation," she replied, and he could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I'd like to meet with you today if possible. My chambers at the courthouse, 11 a.m. Bring your full curriculum documentation." Before Marcus could ask further questions, Judge Harwood ended the call, leaving him staring at his phone in bewilderment. Why would a federal judge take interest in a rejected teaching application at a rural elementary school? What Marcus Bennett couldn't possibly know as he gathered his materials that morning was that his rejection would trigger a chain of events that would not only transform Riverdale's educational system, but would uncover a half-century of hidden educational innovation that would eventually reshape how learning differences were addressed nationwide. The Riverdale County Courthouse stood in stark contrast to the faded storefronts surrounding the town square, a grand limestone structure with imposing columns that seemed to belong to a different era. Marcus climbed the wide steps, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm, still puzzling over why a federal judge would take interest in his rejected application. Inside, the marble floors echoed with his footsteps as he followed the directory to Judge Eliza Harwood's chambers. The building's interior maintained the gravity of justice, high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and the perpetual hush that seemed to absorb sound as effectively as the heavy doors lining the corridors. "Sergeant Bennett," greeted a silver-haired assistant outside the judge's chambers. "Judge Harwood is expecting you." She knocked briefly on the polished oak door before opening it. "Sergeant Bennett has arrived, Your Honor." Judge Eliza Harwood was not what Marcus had expected. In her early 60s, she possessed a commanding presence despite her small stature. Her silver hair was cut in a precise bob, and behind rimless glasses, her eyes carried the sharpness of someone accustomed to seeing beyond surfaces. The chambers reflected its occupant, meticulously organized bookshelves lined with legal volumes, interspersed with what appeared to be educational psychology texts. "Sergeant Bennett," she said, rising from behind her desk to extend her hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. It's not every day I receive a summons from a federal judge, Your Honor," Marcus replied, shaking her hand and noting her firm grip. "Please, sit." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "And this isn't a summons. Let's call it an informal inquiry. I understand Principal Vaughn rejected your application yesterday." Marcus set his portfolio on his lap, unsure of how to navigate this unexpected meeting. "Yes, ma'am. May I ask how you know about this and why it's of interest to the federal court?" Instead of answering directly, Judge Harwood reached into her desk drawer and removed a worn leather journal that looked decades old. "First, I'd like to hear about your learning methodology, specifically how you developed it and why you believe it works where traditional approaches fail." For a moment, Marcus considered asking again how she knew about his application, but something in the judge's expression suggested patience would yield more answers than questions. He opened his portfolio, removed his master curriculum document, and placed it on her desk. It began 15 years ago in Afghanistan, he explained, his voice shifting to the measured tone he used when presenting mission briefs. I was tasked with training new squad members, including several who had nearly washed out of basic training. The conventional instruction methods weren't working, especially under combat conditions. Judge Harwood listened intently, occasionally making notes as Marcus outlined his methodology, a system that identified individual processing patterns and adapted teaching methods accordingly, rather than forcing all learners into standardized approaches. I noticed that many soldiers categorized as difficult to train weren't actually resistance-focused or incapable. Marcus continued, they simply processed information through different pathways than conventional training addressed. By mapping these pathways and creating adaptive learning sequences, we achieved breakthrough results. And you've documented these results systematically? The judge asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Yes, ma'am. Marcus extracted several case files from his portfolio. 15 years of data across 127 individuals, each presenting with different learning challenges. The methodology has been refined through 4 major iterations, with each version incorporating new cognitive research and practical outcomes. For nearly an hour, Judge Harwood asked precise technical questions about his approach, questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of educational psychology and cognitive development, far beyond what Marcus would expect from someone without specialized training in the field. Your methodology bears striking similarities to the Henderson-Wallace cognitive adaptation framework, she finally said, closing her notebook. Marcus straightened in his chair, surprised. That's not possible, Your Honor. The Henderson-Wallace framework is classified. It was developed for military rehabilitation of traumatic brain injuries and has never been published in civilian literature. A small smile crossed Judge Harwood's face. And yet you're familiar with it, only because Dr. Carson shared limited elements with me after my own TBI recovery. He was involved in its early development. James Carson, Judge Harwood said, nodding. I wondered if that was your connection. We worked together briefly in 1973. Before Marcus could process this new information, Judge Harwood opened the aged leather journal and turned it toward him. The yellowed pages contained handwritten notes and diagrams that looked remarkably similar to elements of his own methodology. But the dates in the margins indicated they were written in 1971, when Marcus was not yet born. This journal belonged to Captain Robert Henderson, Judge Harwood explained. During Vietnam, he developed an alternative training approach for soldiers returning with cognitive impairments that conventional rehabilitation couldn't address. Sound familiar? Marcus stared at the journal, his professional composure momentarily shaken. The diagrams showed learning pathway mapping nearly identical to his own system's foundation, albeit in more rudimentary form. Henderson partnered with Dr. Amelia Wallace, a military psychologist, Judge Harwood continued. Together they created what would eventually become the classified framework you mentioned. But before it was classified and restricted to military use, they implemented it in 7 rural schools across the country, including Pinewood Elementary. Pinewood? Marcus repeated, struggling to connect these historical dots to his current situation. Judge Harwood nodded. From 1971 to 1978, Pinewood Elementary was part of a pioneering program called Adaptive Learning Pathways. The results were remarkable. Children previously labeled learning disabled achieved outcomes that challenged every conventional assumption about cognitive limitations. She stood and moved to a filing cabinet, removing a folder stamped Declassified. 2018 in faded red ink. Then in 1978, the program was abruptly terminated. All documentation was classified under national security provisions, and the participating schools were returned to conventional methodologies with no explanation. But why? Marcus asked. If the program was successful, politics, turf wars between agencies, budget reallocations, the official record is incomplete, Judge Harwood replied, a hint of old frustration in her voice. What matters is that an effective educational approach was essentially buried for decades. She returned to her seat, studying Marcus with a measured gaze. 2 years ago, the original Henderson-Wallace documents were finally declassified. I've been quietly tracking the program's legacy ever since. When your application crossed Principal Vaughn's desk with methodology that mirrors Henderson's original work, it triggered an alert I established in the district system. The pieces were finally aligning in Marcus's mind. You've been monitoring the school's records, not just Pinewood, all 7 original Henderson-Wallace implementation sites, Judge Harwood clarified. I've been waiting for someone to independently rediscover what Henderson and Wallace knew 50 years ago. And here you are, Sergeant Bennett, having reconstructed their methodology without ever having access to their original work. Marcus processed this revelation, connecting his own journey to this hidden history. Dr. Carson must have known. He guided my methodology development, but never directly shared the classified framework. James always respected classification. Boundaries, Judge Harwood agreed. But he understood the value of what Henderson and Wallace created. I suspect he recognized similar instincts in you and nurtured them without explicitly sharing classified material. The judge slid another document across her desk, a court order bearing the federal seal. This is an educational enjoinder under the Equal Educational Opportunity Statute. It temporarily suspends Pinewood's ability to reject qualified learning. Specialists solely on the basis of conventional credentials, when those specialists demonstrate proven methodologies for reaching underserved students. Marcus scanned the document, hardly believing what he was reading. This would override Principal Vaughn's decision. For a 90-day evaluation period, Judge Harwood confirmed. Long enough to demonstrate whether your approach can replicate the success of the original Henderson-Wallace implementation. If it does, the district will have legal grounds to create a permanent exception to their credentialing requirements. She leaned forward, her expression intensifying. But understand what you're stepping into, Sergeant. Principal Vaughn will resist this intervention. The educational establishment protects its territories as fiercely as any military. You'll face obstacles at every turn. With respect, Your Honor, I've navigated hostile territory before, Marcus replied, a hint of his military resolve showing through. These children deserve access to methods that work, regardless of institutional resistance. Good, Judge Harwood said with a satisfied nod. Because there's more at stake than just Pinewood Elementary. If you succeed, we'll have contemporary evidence to support reintroducing the Henderson-Wallace framework nationwide. Thousands of children currently failed by standardized approaches could benefit. As their meeting concluded, Judge Harwood handed Marcus a business card with a handwritten number on the back. My direct line. You'll report to Pinewood tomorrow morning. I'll be informing Principal Vaughn of the court order this afternoon. At the door, she paused. One more thing, Sergeant. Robert Henderson was my brother. He died in Vietnam 2 weeks. After sending me his final research notes, I promised him his work would eventually help the children he never had the chance to teach. Don't make me a liar. As Marcus left the courthouse, autumn sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the town square. The weight of what had just been revealed settled on his shoulders. He wasn't simply pursuing a teaching position. He had unknowingly stepped into a half-century legacy of educational innovation that had been deliberately suppressed. His phone chimed with a text from Dr. Carson. Judge Harwood reached out to you? Marcus typed back, just left her chambers. You knew about Henderson-Wallace all along. The response came quickly. Couldn't tell you directly. Some walls need to be rediscovered, not breached. Henderson's sister has waited a long time for someone like you. What Marcus Bennett couldn't possibly anticipate as he drove back to his cabin to prepare for tomorrow was how fiercely the educational establishment would fight to protect conventional wisdom against innovation, even innovation with 50 years of hidden evidence supporting it. Nor could he foresee how the children labeled as unreachable would respond when finally approached through pathways aligned with their natural cognitive processes. The battle for Pinewood Elementary was about to begin, and with it the potential resurrection of an educational approach that could transform the lives of struggling learners nationwide. The following morning dawned crisp and clear as Marcus approached Pinewood Elementary, the federal court order tucked securely in his briefcase, alongside his curriculum materials. The school building looked different today, not just a place of rejection, but a battlefield in a decades-long war over educational innovation that he hadn't known existed until yesterday. Principal Vaughn was waiting in the front office, her posture rigid and expression glacial. Beside her stood a man in an expensive suit whom Marcus immediately recognized as Superintendent Warren Davidson, the administrative head of Riverdale County Schools. "Mr. Bennett," Principal Vaughn said, emphasizing his civilian title with pointed formality, "I understand you've somehow convinced a federal judge to override standard district hiring protocols." "Good morning, Principal Vaughn. Superintendent Davidson," Marcus replied evenly, refusing to be baited into defensiveness. "Judge Harwood has granted an educational enjoinder for a 90-day implementation of my learning methodology. I'm here to begin working with the students who haven't responded to conventional approaches." Superintendent Davidson stepped forward, his considerable height used to deliberate intimidating effect. "Let's be clear, Mr. Bennett. This court order may force us to provide you temporary access to our facilities, but it doesn't obligate our faculty to support methods that contradict established educational practices." "I don't require faculty support, Superintendent," Marcus responded, maintaining the calm assertiveness that had served him well in military confrontations. "Just access to the students who are currently failing despite your established practices. My methods are designed to function independently of conventional frameworks. That's precisely why they succeed where traditional approaches struggle." Principal Vaughn's lips thinned to a tight line. "Room 118 has been designated for your experiment. You'll be assigned students who have already received comprehensive intervention through our standard protocols. The district psychologist will monitor all sessions and document outcomes according to established metrics." Marcus recognized the strategy immediately. They were setting him up to fail by giving him the most challenging cases and then measuring success by conventional standards that hadn't worked for these children in the first place. It was tactical isolation, a maneuver he'd encountered frequently in resistance scenarios. "I accept those conditions," he said, surprising them both. "With one addition, I'll document outcomes using both your metrics and the adaptive assessment framework I've developed. Judge Harwood has approved both measurement systems for comparison." Before either administrator could object, the office door opened, and a woman in her mid-40s entered, carrying a stack of student files. Her no-nonsense appearance was softened by kind eyes behind practical glasses. "You must be Sergeant Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, district psychologist. I'll be observing your work with our students." Something in her tone suggested she might not be as rigidly opposed as the administrators. Marcus shook her hand, noting her firm grip and direct gaze. "I look forward to working with you, Dr. Mitchell. Objective observation is essential for valid outcomes." "Assessment," Principal Vaughn interjected sharply. "Dr. Mitchell understands district protocols and will ensure all educational standards are maintained during this court-mandated exception." "Of course," Dr. Mitchell replied with professional neutrality. "I've selected 12 students whose response to traditional interventions has been minimal. Their files are ready for your review, Mr. Bennett." As they walked to room 118, leaving the administrators behind, Dr. Mitchell maintained a professional silence until they were out of earshot. Then, surprising Marcus, she spoke in a lowered voice. "The Henderson-Wallace approach, right? I recognized elements of it in your application materials." Marcus stopped mid-stride. "You're familiar with Henderson-Wallace?" She glanced around to ensure they were alone in the corridor. "My doctoral dissertation examined alternative cognitive frameworks. Henderson-Wallace was mentioned once, in a declassified footnote. I've been trying to piece it together for years. From fragmentary references." They resumed walking, Marcus processing this unexpected potential ally. "And the administration doesn't know about your interest?" "Riverdale isn't friendly to educational innovation," she replied carefully. "I've learned to work within the system while looking for opportunities to help the children it fails. Your arrival with a federal court order is the first crack in that system I've seen in 11 years here." Room 118 proved to be a neglected classroom at the end of the building's east wing, far from the main instructional areas and clearly chosen to minimize Marcus's visibility. The space was adequate, though dusty, with outdated furniture and a small collection of worn learning materials. "They've isolated you physically and given you the students they've already written off," Dr. Mitchell said bluntly as she set the files on a desk. "Classic containment strategy. I've operated in worse conditions with fewer resources," Marcus replied, already assessing how to reconfigure the space. "In fact, isolation might work to our advantage. Less institutional interference means more implementation flexibility." Dr. Mitchell watched him with growing curiosity. "You really believe you can reach these children?" Marcus opened the first student file, a boy named Michael Ramirez, age 8, with severe processing difficulties that had resisted multiple conventional interventions. "I don't just believe it, Dr. Mitchell. I know it from experience. These students don't have learning disabilities. They have learning differences that conventional approaches aren't designed to accommodate." "That's essentially what Henderson theorized in his limited published work," she observed, "before it all disappeared. Behind classification barriers." "It disappeared because it worked," Marcus said, continuing through the files. "Judge Harwood shared some of that history yesterday. Successful innovation threatens institutional foundations in education as much as in military structures." As they prepared for the first students to arrive, Marcus efficiently rearranged the classroom, creating distinctive learning stations designed to engage different cognitive pathways simultaneously. Dr. Mitchell helped, her initial professional reserve giving way to genuine interest as Marcus explained the neurological principles behind each configuration. "This doesn't match any conventional learning environment I've studied," she noted, examining a multi-sensory station designed for mathematical concept development. "Because conventional environments are designed for convergent processing," Marcus explained, adjusting a tactile component. "These stations accommodate divergent pathways, allowing concepts to be absorbed through whichever cognitive route is most natural for each learner." The first student to arrive was Michael Ramirez, escorted by his third-grade teacher, who handed him over with barely concealed skepticism before departing without a word. The boy stood uncertainly in the doorway, eyes downcast and shoulders hunched, in the defensive posture of a child accustomed to academic failure. "Hello, Michael," Marcus said, sitting on a stool to bring himself closer to the boy's eye level. "I'm Sergeant Bennett. I used to help soldiers learn difficult things, and now I'd like to help you." The boy glanced up briefly, wariness evident in his expression. "I'm not good at learning. Ms. Wilson says I don't try hard enough." "Different minds learn in different ways," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "We just need to find your way. Would you like to try something that doesn't feel like regular school?" For the next 45 minutes, Dr. Mitchell observed with growing astonishment as Marcus guided Michael through a series of activities that bore little resemblance to conventional academic exercises. Using elements of his adaptive methodology, Marcus quickly identified the boys' primary processing pathways and adjusted accordingly, presenting mathematical concepts through physical movement rather than abstract symbols. "He's responding," Dr. Mitchell whispered, as Michael successfully completed a sequential pattern recognition task that translated directly to multiplication principles, a concept his file indicated he had failed to grasp through traditional instruction for over a year. By the end of the session, Michael had not only demonstrated understanding of basic multiplication patterns, but had actually smiled, an expression his teacher later told Dr. Mitchell she had rarely seen in the classroom. As the day progressed, Marcus worked with 5 more students, each presenting different learning challenges that had resisted conventional approaches. With each child, he quickly adapted his methodology to their specific processing patterns, documenting both their responses and the neural pathways he was targeting. Dr. Mitchell's notes grew increasingly detailed as she witnessed breakthroughs. With students she had previously seen struggle through years of traditional interventions, by afternoon her professional objectivity was visibly strained by the results unfolding before her. "This shouldn't be possible," she said after the last student left, reviewing her documentation of the day's sessions. "Ethan has been completely resistant to reading instruction for 3 years, yet he just decoded 3 sentences independently. Because we approached reading through his primary spatial relational pathways, rather than forcing phonemic processing. As the only valid route," Marcus explained, organizing materials for the next day. "His brain maps language visually, not auditorily. Traditional reading instruction fails him because it demands he use his weakest processing channel instead of his strongest." "That's what Henderson suggested in the fragments I found," Dr. Mitchell said, excitement breaking through her professional reserve. "The idea that cognitive diversity should dictate instructional methodology, not the other way around." Henderson was right, Marcus confirmed. And Wallace expanded the framework to include emotional regulatory impacts on cognitive functioning, another element conventional education largely ignores. As they continued discussing the neurological principles underlying the day's successes, the classroom door opened abruptly. Principal Vaughn entered, accompanied by a man Marcus hadn't seen before, middle-aged with an expensive suit and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Mitchell, you were expected to provide an implementation report by the end of the day," Principal Vaughn said sharply, her gaze shifting between the psychologist and the reorganized classroom with evident disapproval. "I'll have it completed within the hour, Principal Vaughn," Dr. Mitchell replied, her professional demeanor instantly restored. The unknown man stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Gerald Roberts, attorney for the Riverdale School District. I'd like to discuss the parameters of your temporary position here." Marcus recognized the tactical approach, legal pressure following administrative resistance. "I'm operating fully within the parameters established by Judge Harwood's court order, Mr. Roberts. Any questions regarding those parameters should be directed to the federal court." Roberts smiled thinly. "Judge Harwood's order grants you access to implement your methodology, but it doesn't override district policy regarding data collection and outcome assessment. We'll need all your materials submitted for review before tomorrow's sessions." "My materials adapt continuously based on student responses," Marcus replied calmly. "That's the fundamental difference between my approach and conventional fixed sequence instruction. I'd be happy to provide daily session summaries, but the methodology itself isn't a static curriculum that can be submitted for traditional review." Roberts's expression hardened. "That's not acceptable under district policy." "Perhaps we should ask Judge Harwood for clarification," Marcus suggested, reaching for his phone. She provided her direct number specifically for implementation questions. The attorney and Principal Vaughn exchanged glances, their strategy momentarily disrupted by the mention of direct access to the federal judge. That won't be necessary today, Roberts conceded reluctantly, but the district will be filing a formal response to the court order requesting more specific operational guidelines. After they departed, Dr. Mitchell let out a breath she'd been holding. They're going to fight you every step of the way. Of course they are, Marcus replied, continuing his preparations unfazed. They're defending an entrenched system against evidence that their fundamental assumptions might be flawed. That's human nature, not educational philosophy. But these are children, Dr. Mitchell began, gesturing to the progress notes she'd compiled. Or why we'll continue despite the resistance, Marcus finished for her. One day of success won't convince anyone whose identity is built around conventional methodologies, but consistent results over 90 days will be harder to dismiss. As evening approached and they finished organizing for the next day, Dr. Mitchell hesitated at the door. There's something you should know. Pinewood Elementary was one of the original Henderson Wallace implementation sites in the 1970s. There's a sealed archive in the district records room labeled Federal Educational Research Initiative, 1971-1978. No one's allowed to access it. This new piece of information connected another dot in the puzzle Judge Harwood had begun revealing. The district must have documentation from the original program, Marcus realized. Documentation that might validate everything you're doing now, Dr. Mitchell agreed. But accessing those records would require authorization beyond what Judge Harwood's current order provides. As Marcus drove back to his cabin that evening, the scope of what he had stumbled into continued to expand. What had begun as a simple attempt to implement his learning methodology in a rural school had revealed connections to a half-century educational initiative that had been deliberately buried, an initiative that might have transformed learning for thousands of children had it not been classified and suppressed. He called Dr. Carson, who answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for the call. "How was day one at Pinewood?" his mentor asked. "Administratively hostile, but instructionally promising," Marcus replied, describing the day's events and the children's responses to his methodology. "And Sarah Mitchell?" Dr. Carson asked, surprising Marcus with his knowledge of the district psychologist. "You know her?" "I know of her. She's published several papers that carefully dance around Henderson Wallace principles without ever naming them directly. A careful researcher looking for fragments of truth in heavily redacted history." Marcus absorbed this new connection. She mentioned a sealed archive at the district office from the original implementation. If those records contain the complete Henderson Wallace documentation, they would provide historical validation for what you're doing now, Dr. Carson finished. But accessing classified historical records is different from implementing a methodology that resembles them. Judge Harwood's current order doesn't cover that level of intervention. Then I need to build an irrefutable case with these 12 students, Marcus concluded, results that even the most resistant administrators can't dismiss. "It won't be enough," Dr. Carson warned. "Institutional resistance isn't rational, it's existential. Success with 12 children won't overcome 50 years of entrenched educational dogma." "Then what will?" Dr. Carson was silent for a moment. Henderson believed widespread public awareness was the only force powerful enough to overcome institutional inertia. That's why the program was classified, to prevent public demands for immediate nationwide implementation before the system was ready to adapt. As the call ended, Marcus stared out his cabin window at the darkening forest, contemplating the forces aligned against educational innovation and the children caught in the crossfire of institutional self-preservation. The 12 students he'd met today represented thousands nationwide who were failing not because they couldn't learn, but because schools insisted on teaching them through cognitive pathways they couldn't naturally access. What Marcus Bennett couldn't possibly know as he prepared for his second day at Pinewood Elementary was that Principal Vaughn had already initiated emergency protocols to contact state educational authorities, citing unauthorized methodologies being implemented in her school. Nor could he anticipate that one of tomorrow's scheduled students was the grandson of a state senator who had been searching for years for educational approaches that might reach the boy. Conventional schools had failed. The battle for Henderson Wallace was about to expand far beyond the isolated classroom at the end of Pinewood's East Wing, drawing attention from forces that had kept it buried for half a century, and others who had been quietly waiting for its resurrection. By the end of Marcus's first week at Pinewood Elementary, word had begun to spread. What the administration had intended as isolation, placing him in a remote classroom with the children they'd given up on, had instead created a protected space where transformation could occur without constant institutional interference. The results were becoming difficult to ignore. Michael Ramirez, who had never completed a math worksheet independently, solved 20 multiplication problems correctly. Ethan Williams read aloud from a leveled book for the first time in his academic career. Sophia Chen, whose severe anxiety had prevented class participation for 2 years, voluntarily presented a science concept to a small group. Dr. Mitchell documented everything meticulously, maintaining both the district's standard assessment protocols and Marcus's adaptive evaluation frameworks. The comparison was startling. Where conventional measurements showed modest improvements, the adaptive frameworks revealed dramatic shifts in cognitive engagement and information processing. "You're changing how their brains interact with information," Dr. Mitchell observed on Friday afternoon as they reviewed the week's data. "Not just what they know, but how they access and apply knowledge. That's the foundation of Henderson Wallace." Marcus confirmed, arranging materials for the following week. Cognitive pathway optimization rather than content memorization. Build the right roads and the traffic flows naturally. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the classroom door. To their surprise, it was Mrs. Ramirez, Michael's mother, a petite woman in hospital scrubs who had clearly come directly from her nursing shift. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said hesitantly, "but I needed to see this room for myself. Michael has talked about nothing else all week." Marcus invited her in, watching as she surveyed the unconventional learning stations with curious eyes. "He did multiplication," she said, her voice catching slightly. "His teacher sent home a paper with actual check marks instead of corrections. I've been keeping every failed math sheet for 3 years, and this is the first time." She paused, composing herself. "What are you doing differently? His medication hasn't changed." "Your son doesn't need medication for learning," Marcus replied carefully. "He needs instruction that matches his cognitive processing style. Michael thinks in patterns and spatial relationships, not linear sequences. We're teaching multiplication through pattern recognition, not memorization." Mrs. Ramirez's eyes widened. "That's exactly how he organizes his toys at home, in patterns no one else understands, but make perfect sense to him. Because that's how his brain naturally maps information," Marcus explained. "Traditional education forces him to use processing pathways that aren't his strength. We're simply aligning instruction with his natural cognitive architecture." The mother's expression shifted from surprise to something harder, determination. "The school has been telling me for years that he has attention deficits and processing disorders. They've pushed for medication increases every semester." Dr. Mitchell interjected carefully. "The district follows standard diagnostic protocols. The district pathologizes cognitive differences instead of accommodating them," Marcus stated firmly. Michael doesn't have a disorder. He has a different neural organization that conventional education isn't designed to engage. Mrs. Ramirez looked between them, years of maternal concern crystallizing into resolve. There are other parents. We have a support group. They need to know about this. After she left, Dr. Mitchell closed the classroom door with uncharacteristic force. You can't make statements like that to parents, Marcus. You're contradicting official diagnostic determinations and district recommendations. I'm telling the truth, backed by neurological research, he countered. These children are being labeled as deficient when they're simply different. The Henderson-Wallace framework recognized this 50 years ago before it was buried. And there was a reason it was buried, she argued, lowering her voice despite the empty hallway. You're challenging fundamental structures of educational psychology and institutional practice. Those structures don't change because one teacher gets good results in one classroom. They change when parents demand better for their children, Marcus replied. When enough people realize there's an alternative to telling kids they're broken when the system simply doesn't accommodate their cognitive diversity. The weekend passed tensely, with Marcus refining his approach for each student based on their first week's responses. He received 2 cryptic text messages from Dr. Carson. Winds shifting, stay focused. And later, Harrison, name familiar? Monday morning brought the consequence of Mrs. Ramirez's weekend activities. Marcus arrived to find not just his assigned students waiting, but a cluster of parents in the hallway outside room 118. Word had spread through the special education parent network about the ex-soldier whose unconventional methods were reaching unreachable children. Principal Vaughn intercepted him before he could reach the classroom, her expression a mixture of anger and alarm. Mr. Bennett, you are not authorized to speak with parents or discuss your temporary methodologies outside your assigned students. The district council is preparing a cease and desist order. I haven't solicited any parent interactions, Marcus replied calmly. If families are seeking information, that's their right as educational stakeholders. Don't play games, she hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid the watching parents. You've directly contradicted official educational assessments and district intervention protocols. That's not just unprofessional, it potentially exposes the district to liability. I've implemented evidence-based methodologies under a federal court order, Marcus reminded her. Judge Harwood's enjoinder specifically protects educational innovations that demonstrate measurable student progress, which my documentation clearly shows. Their tense exchange was interrupted by the arrival of an imposing figure, a tall, distinguished man in an impeccably tailored suit who moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. The parents in the hallway parted instinctively as he approached. Principal Vaughn, he said, his deep voice carrying easily despite its measured tone. I was hoping for an introduction to Sergeant Bennett. The principal's demeanor transformed instantly from confrontational to deferential. Senator Harrison, I didn't expect. We hadn't been notified of your visit. Marcus immediately recognized the name. Senator William Harrison was not just a state legislator, but the chairman of the Education Appropriations Committee that controlled Riverdale County's school funding. This isn't an official visit, Senator Harrison clarified. I'm here as Ethan Williams' grandfather. I understand Sergeant Bennett has been working with my grandson this past week. The political implications hung in the air as Principal Vaughn struggled to recalibrate her approach. We're implementing a temporary court-mandated pilot program, during which my grandson read independently for the first time in his life, the senator completed for her. After 3 years of failure in your conventional intervention programs, he turned to Marcus, extending his hand. Senator Harrison, my daughter showed me Ethan's reading progress from your sessions. I'd like to understand exactly what you're doing differently." The hallway had gone silent, parents and school staff alike watching this unexpected confrontation between political authority and educational administration. Marcus shook the senator's hand, maintaining the same professional calm he'd shown throughout the week. "I'd be happy to explain the methodology, Senator. Perhaps we could continue this conversation in the classroom. The students are waiting to begin today's sessions." Senator Harrison nodded, following Marcus toward room 118, while Principal Vaughn trailed behind, her carefully constructed resistance strategy crumbling in the face of political reality. The waiting parents exchanged glances, recognizing the shifting power dynamics unfolding before them. Inside the classroom, Dr. Mitchell had already begun setting up the day's learning stations. She froze momentarily upon seeing the senator, but quickly recovered her professional composure. For the next hour, Senator Harrison observed as Marcus worked with Ethan and 2 other students, implementing the adaptive methodology with the same focused attention he'd shown all week. The senator took notes occasionally, asking precise questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of educational challenges. When the session concluded and the students returned to their regular classes, Senator Harrison remained, examining the specialized learning materials Marcus had created. "These look familiar," he commented, studying a spatial relationship mapping tool. "Similar to cognitive rehabilitation approaches used for veterans with traumatic brain injuries." "The principles are related," Marcus acknowledged. "Both involve identifying and optimizing natural cognitive pathways rather than forcing standardized processing routes." The senator nodded thoughtfully. "My military committee work exposed me to some of those rehabilitation innovations. Remarkable results there, too." He turned to face Marcus directly. "You've accomplished more with my grandson in 1 week than the entire special education department has in 3 years. Principal Vaughn, who had been silently observing from near the door, stepped forward. "Senator, I should emphasize that Mr. Bennett's approach hasn't been evaluated for long-term effectiveness or alignment with state standards. I'm less concerned with state standards than with the fact that my grandson can now read." "Senator," Harrison interrupted, his tone remaining measured but carrying unmistakable authority. "Results speak volumes, Principal Vaughn." He turned back to Marcus. "I understand Judge Eliza Harwood issued the court order enabling your work here. She and I have crossed paths on educational reform initiatives before." Something in his tone suggested more than casual acquaintance, and Marcus filed this connection away for later consideration. "Judge Harwood seems deeply committed to effective education for all learners." "Indeed," the senator agreed. "Now, I'd like to discuss how we might expand your pilot beyond these initial 12 students. My office has received 17 calls from parents in this district since Friday, all asking about access to your program." Principal Vaughn's alarm was visible. "Senator, the district has established protocols for program expansion that require extensive review." "I'm familiar with district protocols," Senator Harrison replied. "I'm also familiar with federal educational mandates requiring schools to implement effective methodologies for underserved populations. Perhaps it's time to revisit those priorities." Before the conversation could continue, Marcus's phone chimed. With a text message from Judge Harwood, district filing emergency injunction to suspend program. Court at 1 p.m. Bring all documentation. The educational bureaucracy was mobilizing its defenses more quickly than anticipated. Marcus showed the message to Senator Harrison, whose expression hardened. "So that's how they're playing this," the senator said quietly. "Principal Vaughn, I suggest you inform Superintendent Davidson that I'll be attending this hearing as an interested party. The Appropriations Committee will be very invested in the outcome." After the senator departed and Principal Vaughn retreated to make urgent phone calls, Dr. Mitchell helped Marcus gather his documentation. "This is escalating faster than I expected," she admitted. "The district never moves this quickly on anything." "Because they recognize an existential threat," Marcus replied, organizing the student progress data. "Henderson Wallace doesn't just challenge their methods, it challenges their foundational understanding of learning differences. If cognitive diversity is natural variation rather than pathology, entire institutional structures become questionable." As they prepared for the emergency hearing, Marcus received another message, this one from Dr. Carson. Harrison's wife was in original HW pilot program. Personal stakes. The connection crystallized immediately. Senator Harrison's interest wasn't just about his grandson. It was about a methodology that might have helped his wife decades earlier, before it was buried under classification and institutional resistance. At the courthouse, Marcus found himself in the center of a rapidly expanding conflict. On one side stood the district's legal team, led by attorney Gerald Roberts and flanked by Superintendent Davidson and Principal Vaughn. On the other stood Judge Harwood, who had recused herself from hearing the case due to her prior involvement, but remained present as the original issuing judge. To Marcus's surprise, Dr. Carson had also arrived, his military bearing unmistakable despite his civilian clothes. Most unexpected was the presence of not just Senator Harrison, but 6 other parents from Pinewood Elementary, all with children in Marcus's program. The district's emergency filing sought immediate suspension of the Henderson Wallace implementation, citing unverified methodologies potentially harmful to traditional educational progress and disruption of established district protocols. As the hearing began before Judge Raymond Ortiz, Marcus realized that this was no longer about a single classroom or even a single school. The district's aggressive response had transformed an isolated pilot program into a public confrontation over the very foundations of how learning differences were understood and addressed. Exactly the scenario that had led to Henderson Wallace being classified and buried 50 years earlier. What Marcus Bennett couldn't possibly anticipate as the courthouse battle unfolded was that news outlets had already picked up the story of an ex-soldier's innovative approach helping unreachable children at a struggling rural school, or that 3 other veterans with similar methodologies were already contacting Judge Harwood from across the country. The quiet resurrection of Henderson Wallace had become a lightning rod for long-suppressed questions about cognitive diversity and educational approaches nationwide. Questions that powerful institutional forces had spent decades ensuring would never reach public awareness. The emergency hearing in Judge Ortiz's courtroom became the catalyst that transformed a localized educational dispute into something far more significant. The district's legal team presented their arguments with practiced precision, citing regulatory compliance, credentialing requirements, and the potential disruption to established educational protocols. "Your Honor," concluded Gerald Roberts, the district's attorney, "allowing an unqualified individual to implement unverified methodologies poses an unacceptable risk to students and undermines the entire framework of educational standards this district is mandated to uphold." Judge Ortiz, a methodical jurist known for his thorough approach, turned to Marcus. "Mr. Bennett, do you have legal representation?" Before Marcus could respond, an elegant woman in her 60s rose from the gallery. "If I may, Your Honor." Catherine Winters, Attorney General's Office, Education Division. The state has interest in these proceedings given the potential implications for educational policy statewide. The district's legal team exchanged alarmed glances as the state's highest-ranking education attorney identified herself as an interested party. Judge Ortiz nodded, gesturing for her to approach. "Ms. Winters, what is the state's interest in what appears to be a local administrative matter?" The state has been monitoring the implementation of the Henderson-Wallace framework at Pinewood Elementary, she replied, causing a ripple of whispers through the courtroom. When educational methodologies demonstrate significant effectiveness for traditionally underserved populations, the state has a compelling interest in their proper evaluation. Judge Ortiz studied her carefully. You're familiar with this Henderson-Wallace framework? Intimately, Your Honor. I was part of the legal team that worked on its declassification 2 years ago. The methodology Sergeant Bennett is implementing closely resembles the original program that operated in 7 test sites from 1971 to 1978, including Pinewood Elementary. The revelation that the Attorney General's office had been monitoring the situation shifted the dynamics dramatically. Marcus realized that forces beyond Judge Harwood had been waiting for Henderson-Wallace to resurface. Judge Ortiz turned to Marcus. Mr. Bennett, please approach. I'd like to hear directly about these methods and the results you're documenting. For the next 40 minutes, Marcus presented his methodology and the documented outcomes from the first week of implementation. He explained the neurological principles behind cognitive pathway optimization, how his approach identified and utilized each student's natural processing strengths, and the dramatic improvements already evident in their academic performance. Throughout his presentation, parents in the gallery nodded in recognition of their children's experiences, while the district representatives maintained stone-faced opposition. When Marcus concluded, Judge Ortiz turned to Attorney Winters. The state's position on continuing this program. The state strongly opposes any interruption of the implementation, she replied firmly. We view this as a critical opportunity to evaluate a methodology that shows exceptional promise for addressing persistent achievement gaps in special education populations. Judge Ortiz considered this for a moment before addressing the district's team. Mr. Roberts, does the district have evidence that Mr. Bennett's methods have caused harm to any student? Not demonstrable harm, Your Honor, the attorney admitted reluctantly. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. These untested methods could have long-term detrimental effects. Untested, Senator Harrison interrupted, rising from his seat. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce information directly relevant to these proceedings. After being recognized, the senator approached the bench, presenting a folder of documents. These are the original implementation records from Henderson-Wallace at Pinewood Elementary, 1971-1974. As chairman of the State Education Appropriations Committee, I requested these from secured archives following my grandson's remarkable progress under Sergeant Bennett's instruction. The district representatives visibly paled as Senator Harrison continued. These records show that during the original Henderson-Wallace implementation, Pinewood Elementary's special education population achieved the highest academic growth metrics in state history, results that have never been matched since the program was terminated in 1978. Judge Ortiz reviewed the documents carefully before looking up. Mr. Roberts, was the district aware of these historical records? The attorney glanced at Superintendent Davidson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. The district was aware of a federal program in the 1970s, Your Honor, but not its specific methodologies or outcomes. That statement is false, came a clear voice from the gallery as Dr. Mitchell stood. Your Honor, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, district psychologist at Pinewood Elementary. The sealed archives in the district records room contain complete documentation of the Henderson-Wallace implementation, including methodological frameworks and student outcome data. Access has been repeatedly denied to educational staff, myself included. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Judge Ortiz banged his gavel for order. Dr. Mitchell, are you stating that the district has deliberately concealed relevant educational methodologies that demonstrated exceptional effectiveness? Yes, Your Honor, she replied firmly. For the 11 years I've been employed by Riverdale, those records have been designated restricted access despite multiple formal requests to utilize them for improving special education outcomes. Superintendent Davidson rose, his face flushed with anger. Your Honor, those records were sealed under federal directive. The district was legally prohibited from accessing or implementing any elements of that experimental program. Another false statement, Attorney Winters interjected. I have here the declassification order dated October 17, 2018, which was sent to all 7 original implementation sites, including Riverdale School District. The directive explicitly encouraged districts to review the methodology for potential contemporary applications. Judge Ortiz's expression hardened as the deliberate suppression of educational innovation became increasingly apparent. I've heard enough to make a preliminary determination. The district's emergency request to suspend Sergeant Bennett's program is denied. Furthermore, I'm issuing an immediate order for complete access to all Henderson Wallace documentation in district possession. He turned to Marcus. Sergeant Bennett, you are authorized to continue your implementation with the currently assigned students. Additionally, I'm extending Judge Harwood's original enjoinder to permit expansion to any student whose parents formally request inclusion. The victory was more comprehensive than Marcus had dared hope for, but the district's representatives were already huddling with their legal team, clearly planning their next counterattack. As the courtroom began to clear, Dr. Carson approached, Marcus speaking quietly. This is just the beginning, he warned. When Henderson Wallace first emerged, powerful educational interests mobilized to contain it. The same will happen now, but with greater intensity because of the public dimension. Why is there such resistance to methods that demonstrably work? Marcus asked, gathering his documentation. Dr. Carson's expression was grim. Because Henderson Wallace challenges the foundation of how learning differences are categorized and addressed. If cognitive diversity is natural variation rather than pathology, billions in pharmaceutical interventions, specialized programming and diagnostic infrastructure become questionable. Entire professional identities and institutional systems are threatened. As they spoke, parents surrounded Marcus, eager to discuss their children's potential inclusion in the expanded program. The atmosphere had shifted from cautious hope to determined advocacy as families realized effective alternatives existed to the labels and limitations the system had placed on their children. Dr. Mitchell joined them, her professional demeanor strained by the day's confrontations. The superintendent has called an emergency staff meeting for this afternoon. They're going to attempt damage control and likely pressure teachers to publicly oppose your methods. Will you be safe after speaking out in court? Marcus asked. Concerned for her professional standing, she straightened, resolved despite her evident anxiety. I've complied with district protocols for 15 years while watching children fail unnecessarily. I can't continue prioritizing institutional comfort over educational effectiveness. As the courthouse cleared, Judge Harwood approached Marcus with Senator Harrison beside her. You handled that extremely well, Sergeant Bennett, she said, but understand that today's victory has escalated this beyond a local educational dispute. My brother's work is finally receiving the public attention it deserves, which means those who buried it the first time will respond accordingly. Senator Harrison nodded gravely. The opposition will shift from administrative to political. My committee position provides some protection, but educational institutions have deep influence in legislative bodies. We need to focus on the students, Marcus insisted. Political battles mean nothing if we don't deliver actual results for these children. The results are precisely what make this dangerous, Judge Harwood countered. Henderson Wallace was buried 50 years ago because it worked too well. It demonstrated that thousands of children diagnosed with learning disabilities were actually completely capable of academic success when approached through their natural, cognitive pathways. As they parted ways, Marcus received a text from an unknown number, classified files on other 6 implementation sites available. Need secure contact. A friend from 1978. The mysterious message confirmed what he had suspected. The original Henderson Wallace network had gone underground rather than disappeared completely. Somewhere, other educators had preserved the methodology despite institutional suppression. The afternoon brought evidence of the district's counter-offensive. When Marcus arrived at Pinewood Elementary to prepare for the next day's sessions, he found the entrance to room 118 blocked by maintenance workers, installing a new lock for security purposes. Several teachers who had previously shown quiet interest in his methods now avoided eye contact in the hallway. Principal Vaughn intercepted him with cold efficiency. "The district is complying with Judge Ortiz's ruling, Mr. Bennett. You may continue your program, but all materials must remain on school property, and all sessions will be video recorded for quality assurance. Additionally, all participating students must undergo comprehensive psychological evaluation before and after participation." The strategy was evident: create bureaucratic obstacles and surveillance pressure while building an alternative record that could be selectively interpreted to undermine his results. The district couldn't stop him directly after the court ruling, but they could create conditions designed to inhibit effectiveness. "I understand, Principal Vaughn," Marcus replied with the calm he'd developed through multiple combat deployments. "I'll need written copies of these new requirements for my records, and I'll be implementing session recording from my perspective as well to ensure complete documentation from all angles." Her slight frown revealed his countermove hadn't been anticipated. "That won't be necessary. The district's recording systems are sufficient. Judge Ortiz specifically authorized dual documentation frameworks," Marcus reminded her. "My recording equipment will be set up by tomorrow morning." As Principal Vaughn walked away, visibly displeased, Dr. Mitchell approached cautiously, keeping her voice low. "They're planning comprehensive resistance. Teachers have been warned that associating with your program could impact their evaluations. Parents are being told that participation might affect their children's eligibility for existing support services. Institutional self-preservation at the expense of children's progress," Marcus observed. "Exactly what Henderson and Wallace faced 50 years ago." "But they have a vulnerability they didn't anticipate," Dr. Mitchell replied, handing him a flash. "Drive. This contains copies of the original Henderson Wallace implementation records from 1971-1974. I made digital copies years ago when briefly granted access for a district assessment project. They show not just methodology, but long-term follow-up data on the original participants." Marcus stared at the small device, recognizing its significance. "This would provide the historical validation connecting my current implementation to the original program. More importantly," Dr. Mitchell continued, "it includes tracking data on the original student cohort. The children from the Henderson Wallace program at Pinewood showed not just immediate academic improvement, but significantly higher rates of college completion, career advancement, and life satisfaction in long-term follow-up studies. Before those studies were classified." As evening approached, Marcus returned to his cabin to review the historical documents, finding striking parallels between his independently developed methods and the original Henderson Wallace framework. The core principles were nearly identical: identify natural cognitive processing pathways, align instructional approaches with those pathways rather than forcing standardized methods, and build metacognitive awareness to help learners understand their own information processing strengths. Most revealing were the handwritten notes from Captain Henderson himself. describing how his work with injured soldiers had revealed that cognitive differences weren't deficiencies, but variations that required different instructional approaches. Exactly the conclusion Marcus had reached through his own military experience. His phone rang as he was comparing assessment frameworks. Judge Harwood calling with urgent news. The district has filed an emergency appeal to the State Board of Education, she informed him, without preamble. They're arguing that Judge Ortiz's ruling infringes on educational sovereignty and certification requirements. Simultaneously, the State Department of Education has received formal complaints about unqualified interference in special education protocols. They're attacking on multiple fronts, Marcus observed, unsurprised by the escalation. This was always their strategy 50 years ago, Judge Harwood confirmed. When direct opposition failed, they mobilized regulatory and bureaucratic mechanisms to contain innovation through procedural strangulation. But we have something they didn't have then, Marcus noted. Public visibility. Parents are seeing results with their own children. That's harder to suppress than classified research documents. Precisely why you need to prepare for personal attacks next, she warned. When institutional mechanisms fail, they'll attempt to discredit you individually. Your military background, your traumatic brain injury history, anything that can be used to undermine public confidence in your methods. The prediction proved accurate, faster than either expected. By the following morning, local news outlets were running stories questioning the experimental teaching methods being implemented by an unqualified veteran with PTSD at Pinewood Elementary. The careful framing cast concerned administrators as protectors of educational standards against dangerous innovation. What neither the district nor its media allies anticipated was the immediate response from military veterans organizations and parents of the affected children. By noon, those same news outlets were being flooded with first-hand testimonials from families witnessing remarkable transformations in children previously written off by the educational system. As Marcus arrived at Pinewood that morning, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. A small group of parents stood at the school entrance, wearing hastily made T-shirts reading, "Support Henderson Wallace," and "Cognitive diversity is not pathology." Among them were several military veterans who had heard about the district's attacks and come to show solidarity. Inside, the isolation tactics had intensified. Marcus found his classroom materials rearranged according to district organizational standards, and a district psychologist waiting to observe all sessions for compliance purposes. Yet the very students the system had previously deemed unreachable continued to demonstrate remarkable progress, rendering the obstructionist tactics increasingly transparent. By the end of the second week, 27 additional families had formally requested inclusion in the program, overwhelming the district's capacity for obstruction. Senator Harrison had introduced emergency funding for expanded implementation, and 3 teachers from Pinewood had quietly approached Marcus about training in his methodology despite administrative pressure. What Marcus Bennett couldn't possibly know as he continued documenting the children's progress was that similar challenges to educational orthodoxy were simultaneously emerging in 4 other states, all connected to veterans who had independently developed variants of the Henderson Wallace approach through their military experiences. The buried methodology wasn't just resurfacing, it was evolving into a nationwide movement that would fundamentally challenge how learning differences were understood and addressed in American education. 1 month had passed since the emergency. Court hearing and room 118 at Pinewood Elementary had transformed from an isolated classroom into the epicenter of an educational revolution that was spreading far beyond Riverdale County. The district's attempts to contain and undermine Marcus's program had backfired dramatically, drawing national media attention to the remarkable results his students were achieving. The transformation of Michael Ramirez had become emblematic of the program's success. Once labeled with multiple learning disabilities and dependent on increasing medication, he was now functioning 2 grade levels above his age peers in mathematics and approaching grade level in reading. His mother, Elena Ramirez, had emerged as one of the most powerful advocates for the Henderson-Wallace approach, her nursing background lending credibility to her passionate testimony before the State Board of Education. "My son was not broken," she told the packed hearing room, her voice steady despite her emotion. "The system's approach to teaching him was. Sergeant Bennett didn't fix my child. He fixed the way information was presented to him." The classroom that the administration had intended as isolation now required 3 additional spaces to accommodate the 64 students whose parents had formally requested inclusion in the program. Marcus had trained 7 teachers in the basic principles of cognitive pathway optimization, creating a team that worked collaboratively to implement individualized approaches for each student. Dr. Mitchell, initially cautious about publicly supporting methods that contradicted district protocols, had become the program's most rigorous documenter. Her dual framework assessment approach created irrefutable evidence of effectiveness that even the most skeptical educational researchers couldn't dismiss. "The data speaks for itself," she explained to a visiting delegation from the state university's education department. "We're seeing an average 340% improvement in learning acquisition rates across all cognitive processing patterns. Most significantly, behavioral incidents have decreased by 87% among previously designated problem students when their learning is aligned with their natural processing pathways." Marcus had expected institutional resistance, but he hadn't anticipated the groundswell of public support that emerged as results became impossible to ignore. Veterans organizations had rallied around him when the district attempted character assassination, countering with stories of his exceptional service record and innovative training approaches in combat zones. Parents of children with learning differences formed advocacy networks that spread rapidly through social media, sharing implementation techniques and documentation strategies that could be replicated in other districts. What had begun as one ex-soldier's attempt to help struggling students had evolved into a grassroots movement challenging fundamental assumptions about cognitive diversity. The district's resistance continued, but grew increasingly ineffective as public opinion shifted. When Superintendent Davidson attempted to implement new, standardized assessment protocols designed to undermine the program's results, Senator Harrison countered by introducing legislation mandating multiple assessment frameworks for any educational innovation, showing significant effectiveness for underserved populations. On this particular morning, Marcus arrived at Pinewood to find an unusual visitor waiting. A distinguished man in his 70s, using a cane but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. "Sergeant Bennett," the man greeted him with a firm handshake. "Dr. Walter Wallace, I believe you've been implementing a methodology that bears part of my name." Marcus stared in momentary shock. Dr. Amelia Wallace's research partner from the original program had been reported deceased in the declassified documents. "That information was deliberately falsified during classification," Dr. Wallace explained, noting Marcus's surprise. "Easier to suppress a methodology when one creator is dead and the other's family has been sworn to secrecy." As they walked toward room 118, Dr. Wallace observed the learning stations and adaptive materials with evident emotion. "It's remarkable how closely your independently developed approach mirrors what Amelia and Robert created 50 years ago. The same core principles, refined for contemporary application. Dr. Carson provided guidance that now makes more sense," Marcus acknowledged. "He must have known more about the original framework than he could explicitly share due to classification restrictions." Dr. Wallace nodded. James was always careful about technical compliance while finding ways to preserve the essential methodology. There were several of us who refused to let Henderson Wallace die completely, maintaining small implementation cells while waiting for the right moment to reintroduce it publicly. As students began arriving for the morning session, Dr. Wallace watched with evident wonder as children previously labeled as learning disabled engaged confidently with complex concepts through their natural cognitive pathways. "This is exactly what Robert envisioned," he said quietly. "Children thriving once we stopped forcing standardized processing routes and instead built instructional approaches aligned with their natural cognitive architecture." The morning's activities were interrupted by the arrival of a film crew from a national news program, accompanied by Attorney General Catherine Winters. The story of Pinewood's transformation had caught national attention, particularly after Senator Harrison's impassioned speech on the Senate floor about educational innovation and cognitive diversity. "Sergeant Bennett," Attorney General Winters greeted him, "the governor has requested a comprehensive briefing on Henderson Wallace implementation. Your results here have triggered interest in statewide expansion of the methodology. The presence of national media transformed what had been a local educational dispute into a national conversation about learning differences and institutional resistance to innovation." Dr. Wallace's surprise appearance added historical validation that couldn't be dismissed, particularly when he revealed the existence of longitudinal data tracking the original Henderson Wallace students through adulthood. The original cohort from all 7 implementation sites demonstrated not just immediate academic improvement, but significantly better life outcomes across multiple metrics, he explained to the assembled reporters. Higher college completion rates, lower incidence of mental health challenges, greater career stability, and higher self-reported life satisfaction. Then the program was terminated and the results classified. The question that had haunted Marcus since discovering the program's history finally received a public answer when a reporter asked directly, "Dr. Wallace, why would an educational approach with such positive outcomes be shut down and classified?" Dr. Wallace's expression darkened with old frustration. Powerful institutional and commercial interests recognized that Henderson Wallace fundamentally challenged their paradigm. If learning differences are natural cognitive variations rather than pathologies, requiring pharmaceutical and specialized educational interventions, entire industries lose their foundation. The classification was never about national security. It was about protecting entrenched financial and professional interests. As cameras captured students demonstrating remarkable progress through adaptive methodologies, Principal Vaughn and Superintendent Davidson maintained their opposition, though increasingly isolated as public support for the program grew. Their arguments about credentials and conventional protocols rang hollow against the visible evidence of children succeeding where traditional approaches had failed them. By late afternoon, as the media departed with compelling footage of transformed students, Marcus found himself in conversation with Dr. Wallace, Judge Harwood, and Senator Harrison, an impromptu council of the past and present champions of the methodology. "What you've accomplished here goes beyond validating Henderson Wallace," Judge Harwood observed. "You've created a contemporary implementation that demonstrates its relevance for today's educational challenges. My brother would be profoundly moved to see his work not just preserved, but evolved." Senator Harrison nodded agreement. "The political landscape is different now, too. 50 years ago, institutional forces could suppress innovation through classification and bureaucratic isolation. Today, parents have platforms to share results directly, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. The question becomes strategic direction," Dr. Wallace said. How do we ensure Henderson Wallace doesn't get co-opted, diluted, or marginalized again now that it's emerging publicly? Implementation quality will be critical as it expands. Marcus considered this carefully. We need a systematic training approach for educators, rigorous documentation protocols, and protection against institutional interference. Most importantly, we need to maintain the core principles while allowing for evolution based on new neurological research. The conversation extended into the evening as they began mapping a strategy for responsible expansion of the methodology, drawing on lessons from both the original program's suppression and the contemporary resurrection at Pinewood. 3 other veterans with similar approaches had already reached out following the media coverage, creating potential for coordinated implementation across multiple states. What none of them could fully appreciate in that moment was how completely the landscape of learning differences would transform over the coming years, as Henderson Wallace principles spread from Pinewood Elementary to educational institutions nationwide. The methodology that had been buried for half a century was about to fundamentally reshape how cognitive diversity was understood and addressed in American education. As Marcus walked back to his cabin that evening, his phone rang with a call from Dr. Carson. "I just saw the national coverage," his mentor said without preamble. "Walter Wallace coming forward publicly changes everything. The full historical record can now emerge without classification barriers. He mentioned you were part of preserving the methodology," Marcus noted. "Many of us recognized what was happening when Henderson Wallace was buried," Dr. Carson confirmed. "We couldn't fight the classification directly, but we could preserve the core principles and guide others toward rediscovering them through apparently independent means." The strategic patience of those who had maintained the methodology's essence, while waiting for the right moment for public resurrection, struck Marcus as remarkable. "You never told me directly about Henderson Wallace, but you guided my development in ways that led me to the same principles." "Because discovered truth is more powerful than transmitted information," Dr. Carson replied. "When you developed these approaches through your own experience with soldiers, you gained an ownership and understanding no training program could provide. Now you're doing the same with these teachers at Pinewood, helping them discover rather than simply instructing them." As they spoke, Marcus received an email notification from Judge Harwood containing digital copies of the complete declassified Henderson Wallace archives from all 7 original implementation sites. The comprehensive documentation provided both historical validation and implementation guidance that would prove invaluable as the methodology expanded. "There's something you should know," Dr. Carson said before ending the call. "Robert Henderson experienced significant resistance when he first developed these approaches for injured soldiers. Military hierarchies can be as resistant to innovation as educational institutions. What made him persevere was his unshakable belief that cognitive diversity is a strength to be leveraged, not a deficiency to be corrected. You share that fundamental understanding." The following morning brought evidence of how rapidly events were accelerating. Marcus arrived at Pinewood to find a formal letter from the governor's office announcing the formation of a cognitive diversity innovation task force, with Marcus named as implementation coordinator alongside Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Wallace, and representatives from veterans organizations and parent advocacy groups. Principal Vaughn delivered the letter with visible resignation. Her earlier opposition, now politically untenable as state leadership, embraced the very methodology she had attempted to block. "The superintendent asks that all media inquiries be directed through the district office," she said stiffly, the final procedural gesture of an administrative battle already lost. As students arrived for their morning session, parents gathered. Outside, wearing T-shirts now professionally printed with "Cognitive diversity is not pathology" and Henderson Wallace works. What had begun as desperate advocacy had evolved into a coordinated movement with growing political influence. Michael Ramirez bounded into the classroom, proudly holding up a math test from his regular classroom, marked with a large A+ at the top. "Ms. Wilson says I can help teach the other kids now," he announced, his confidence transformed from the defeated child Marcus had first encountered. "I explained multiplication my way, and 3 of them understood it better." This, Marcus realized, represented the most powerful aspect of Henderson Wallace, not just immediate academic improvement, but the metacognitive awareness that allowed children to understand their own learning processes. These students weren't just mastering content, they were developing the ability to recognize and leverage their natural cognitive strengths. What Marcus Bennett couldn't possibly anticipate as he celebrated Michael's success was that within 5 years, Henderson Wallace principles would be implemented in over 2,000 schools nationwide, with longitudinal studies confirming the same remarkable outcomes observed 50 years earlier. The methodology he had helped resurrect would transform not just educational practices, but fundamental understandings of cognitive diversity across professional fields, from corporate training to rehabilitation medicine. The buried innovation that had traveled from Vietnam-era military rehabilitation through classification and suppression to a rural elementary school had finally emerged into the light, carried forward by an ex-soldier whose own cognitive journey had led him to rediscover truths too powerful to remain hidden forever. 5 years had passed since Marcus Bennett's initial rejection at Pinewood Elementary. The autumn morning carried a crisp energy as he stood at the podium in the National Academy of Education's Grand Auditorium in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver the keynote address at the first International Conference on Cognitive Diversity in Education. The journey from an isolated classroom in a struggling rural school to this moment of international recognition had unfolded with a momentum that still occasionally left Marcus breathless. What had begun as one ex-soldier's attempt to implement an innovative learning approach had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of how cognitive differences were understood and addressed in educational systems worldwide. The principles we now call Henderson Wallace cognitive pathway optimization weren't revolutionary because they were novel, Marcus began, surveying the audience of over 2,000 educators, researchers and policymakers from 63 countries. They were revolutionary because they recognized an essential truth that had been systematically overlooked. Cognitive diversity is natural human variation, not pathology requiring correction. In the front row sat Michael Ramirez, now 14 years old and entering high school as an honors student, despite his continued classification as learning disabled in his early elementary years. Beside him were his mother Eleanor, now the executive director of the National Cognitive Diversity Alliance, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, whose rigorous documentation of the Pinewood implementation had set the gold standard for educational innovation. Assessment nationwide. The most powerful aspect of this approach isn't the specific techniques, Marcus continued. It's the fundamental shift in perspective, seeing different cognitive processing patterns as equally valid rather than measuring all minds against a standardized template that serves only a portion of the population. As he spoke, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary developments of the past 5 years. The Henderson Wallace methodology had been implemented in over 3,000 schools across 47 states and 17 countries. Longitudinal studies had confirmed what the original classified research had shown 50 years earlier. When instruction aligned with natural cognitive pathways, students previously labeled as learning disabled demonstrated not just academic, Improvement but transformative growth across social, emotional, and metacognitive dimensions. Most significant had been the paradigm shift in how learning differences were conceptualized. Where once children were labeled with deficit-focused diagnoses when they struggled with standardized instruction, the growing influence of cognitive diversity frameworks had shifted emphasis to identifying and optimizing natural processing strengths. The language of educational assessment had evolved from pathologizing difference to recognizing diverse cognitive architectures. The legacy of Henderson Wallace isn't just educational methodology, Marcus told the attentive audience. It's the recognition that human cognitive variation is as natural and valuable as biodiversity in an ecosystem. Different processing patterns offer unique perspectives and capabilities that enrich our collective understanding and problem-solving capacity. In the years since the Pinewood implementation, the original resistance had gradually transformed into institutional adoption as results became impossible to ignore. Principal Vaughn had retired, replaced by Dr. Mitchell, who had transformed Pinewood Elementary into a national model for cognitive diversity-focused education. Superintendent Davidson had initially maintained opposition before eventually claiming to have supported innovative approaches all along when the political winds shifted decisively. The educational establishment that had once rejected Marcus's application now invited him to train their teachers. Pharmaceutical companies that had pushed medication as the primary intervention for learning differences now funded research into cognitive pathway optimization. The institutional structures that had buried Henderson Wallace 50 years earlier were being transformed from within as a new generation of educators embraced its principles. Senator Harrison had become one of the methodology's most influential advocates, securing federal funding for implementation research and teacher training programs nationwide. His personal connection through his grandson Ethan, now a confident high school junior, planning to study educational neuroscience in college, lent emotional resonance to his policy arguments. What began in room 118 at Pinewood Elementary wasn't just an alternative teaching approach, Marcus continued. It was the resurrection of a paradigm that honors cognitive diversity as a strength rather than treating it as a deficit requiring remediation. Dr. Walter Wallace, now 82, but still vibrantly engaged in the movement, watched from his wheelchair in the front row. His decision to come forward publicly had unleashed the complete historical record of the original program, providing validation that accelerated contemporary acceptance. The recently established Wallace-Henderson Institute for Cognitive Diversity Research now coordinated implementation and assessment across multiple countries. Judge Eliza Harwood sat beside him, her brother's legacy finally receiving the recognition it deserved. The classification that had buried his innovations for decades had been fully lifted, revealing the comprehensive brilliance of his original vision. Captain Robert Henderson was now recognized in educational literature as a pioneering figure whose insights had arrived a half-century before institutional systems were ready to embrace them. As Marcus concluded his address, he focused on the future directions of the movement that had grown far beyond his individual contribution. The next phase of this work requires us to extend these principles beyond traditional educational settings, he explained. Workforce development, rehabilitation medicine, correctional education, and corporate training all continue to operate on standardized cognitive templates that fail to engage diverse processing patterns. Our challenge is to bring cognitive diversity frameworks to every environment where human learning occurs. The standing ovation that followed reflected not just appreciation for Marcus's role, but recognition of the collective journey that had transformed educational understanding. As he left the podium, Dr. Carson embraced him with evident pride. Robert and Amelia would be amazed to see their work finally achieving its potential, the older man said, referring to the original creators. The classification buried it for 50 years, but truth has a persistence that eventually overcomes institutional resistance. The afternoon brought a pivotal moment in the methodology's evolution as Marcus formally announced the transition of leadership for the National Implementation Initiative. While I'll continue active involvement in research and development, operational leadership of the Henderson-Wallace National Implementation Network will transition to our newly established team of certified practitioners, he explained during the press conference. This includes educators, psychologists, and most importantly, graduates of the original Pinewood cohort who have unique insight into the methodology's impact. Michael Ramirez stepped forward as the youngest member of the Leadership Council, his transformation from struggling student to articulate advocate embodying the methodology's potential. What Sergeant Bennett gave us wasn't just better teaching, he told the assembled journalists. He gave us understanding of how our minds naturally work and permission to learn through those pathways instead of being forced into processing routes that didn't match our cognitive architecture. The media coverage emphasized the grassroots nature of the movement's spread, not through traditional top-down institutional channels, but through parents, individual teachers, and veterans who had recognized the methodology's effectiveness and advocated for its implementation despite initial resistance. As evening approached and the conference transitioned to a recognition ceremony for pioneers in cognitive diversity research, Marcus found a moment of quiet reflection in a side hallway of the grand building. 5 years earlier, he had sat in Principal Vaughn's office facing rejection based on his lack of conventional credentials. The journey from that moment to international recognition had unfolded through an extraordinary series of connections and courageous individuals who had championed innovation over institutional comfort. Dr. Mitchell joined him there, her professional demeanor mellowed by years of collaborative work. "I was thinking about that first day in room 118, she said. I was so frightened of contradicting district protocols, even when I knew they weren't serving our students effectively. "You took the greatest professional risk," Marcus acknowledged. "I was an outsider with nothing to lose. You put a 15-year career on the line to support what you recognized as effective." "Because results matter more than institutional comfort," she replied, echoing the phrase that had become something of a mantra in their work. Watching Michael and the others transform once their learning aligned with their natural cognitive pathways made institutional risk irrelevant. The evening ceremony brought formal recognition to the complete historical journey of the Henderson-Wallace methodology, from its origins in Vietnam-era military rehabilitation through its classification and suppression to its contemporary resurrection and evolution. Tributes to Robert Henderson and Amelia Wallace highlighted how their original insights had anticipated neurological research that would only be confirmed decades later. Judge Harwood accepted a posthumous award on her brother's behalf, her voice steady despite evident emotion. "Robert understood that minds are as unique as fingerprints," she told the audience. "He recognized that cognitive diversity isn't deviation from a standard, but natural variation to be honored and engaged. The system wasn't ready for that truth 50 years ago. I'm profoundly grateful it's finally being embraced today." The most moving moment came when graduates of both the original 1970s implementation and the contemporary Pinewood program shared the stage, connecting generations separated by decades, but united by the experience of having their natural cognitive strengths recognized and engaged after years of struggling within standardized approaches. Among them stood Senator Harrison's wife, Martha, one of the original Henderson-Wallace students from a different implementation site, whose life trajectory had been transformed through the program before it was terminated. Her presence created powerful continuity between past and present. Her grandson Ethan beside her, representing the continuation of that legacy. The most damaging aspect of having the program terminated wasn't losing specific teaching techniques, she explained to the rapt audience. It was returning to an educational paradigm that pathologized my natural cognitive processing patterns instead of recognizing them as valid variations. That shift in perspective affects not just academic performance, but fundamental self-understanding and identity formation. As the formal proceedings concluded and attendees mingled during the reception, Marcus found himself approached by a young Army lieutenant in dress uniform. "Sergeant Bennett," she said with a crisp salute. "Lieutenant Rebecca Gonzalez, Walter. Reed Rehabilitation Division. We've implemented your cognitive pathway optimization protocols with wounded warriors recovering from traumatic brain injuries. The results have been extraordinary, particularly in cases where traditional rehabilitation approaches had plateaued." The military connection completed a circle that had begun with Henderson's work with injured soldiers decades earlier and continued through Marcus's own experience, developing training approaches for diverse learners in his unit. The methodology that had originated in military necessity had returned to serve a new generation of wounded warriors while simultaneously transforming civilian education. The principles transfer seamlessly because they're based on fundamental neurological realities, Lieutenant Gonzalez continued. Our neuroplasticity specialists are documenting recovery patterns that challenge conventional expectations for cognitive rehabilitation timelines. As the evening wound down, Dr. Carson gathered Marcus, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Wallace, and Judge Harwood for a quiet moment away from the crowds. "I wish Robert could see this," he said, his eyes reflecting decades of carrying forward his colleagues' vision through classification barriers and institutional resistance. He never wavered in his belief that this approach would eventually transform education, even when they buried his work and forced us underground. "He's seeing it through all of us," Judge Howard replied, gesturing toward the hall where hundreds of educators were eagerly discussing implementation strategies for their home institutions. "Through every child who discovers how their mind naturally works and finds permission to learn through those pathways." Dr. Wallace nodded agreement. "Robert always said the truth would eventually emerge because it works. Institutional resistance can delay effective innovation, but results eventually speak louder than credentials or protocols." As Marcus prepared to leave the evening's events, a staff member approached with an unexpected message. "The Secretary of Education would like to meet with you tomorrow morning," she informed him. "The department is establishing a Cognitive Diversity Innovation Office and would like to discuss your potential involvement. The institutional adoption that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier had become inevitable as results accumulated across diverse implementation sites." The approach that Principal Vaughn had rejected for lacking proper credentials was now reshaping national educational policy through undeniable effectiveness. What Marcus Bennett couldn't fully appreciate as he considered this latest development was how completely the educational landscape would transform over the coming decades as cognitive diversity frameworks became the standard rather than the exception. The methodology that had journeyed from military rehabilitation through classification and rejection to a rural elementary school would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant educational innovations of the century, not because it introduced novel techniques, but because it recognized an essential truth about human cognitive variation that had been systematically overlooked. As he walked through the evening air toward his hotel, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of connections that had unfolded from his initial rejection at Pinewood Elementary. Judge Harwood's intervention had created the opportunity for implementation. Dr. Mitchell's courage had provided critical documentation. Senator Harrison's influence had offered political protection. Dr. Wallace's emergence had supplied historical validation. Throughout it all, Dr. Carson had guided with the patient wisdom of someone who had maintained faith in an innovation's eventual resurrection, despite decades of suppression. Individual courage in the face of institutional resistance had preserved a methodology too effective to remain buried forever. The children, who had been labeled as deficient by standardized approaches, had demonstrated remarkable capabilities when their natural cognitive pathways were engaged. Their transformations had spoken louder than any credential or protocol, eventually compelling even the most resistant systems to acknowledge a fundamental truth: cognitive diversity isn't pathology. It's the natural variation of human minds, each with unique strengths to be leveraged rather than differences to be corrected. The ex-soldier, once rejected for lacking proper educational credentials, had catalyzed a movement that would eventually transform not just how learning differences were addressed, but how human cognitive variation itself was understood and valued. The journey that began with a simple desire to help struggling students had evolved into a fundamental reassessment of the labels, limitations, and standardized expectations imposed on diverse minds. In the end, the most powerful aspect of the Henderson-Wallace legacy wasn't specific techniques or approaches, but the revolutionary perspective that cognitive diversity represents natural human variation, to be honored rather than deviation to be corrected. The paradigm shift that had been buried through classification 50 years earlier had finally emerged to reshape education for generations to come, carried forward by individuals who recognize that effectiveness matters more than institutional comfort when children's potential hangs in the balance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.